play a game?
Why, yes, I believe we shall.
Oh, I got a live one here.
Getting geeky all up in your podcast. It's Shane Plays Geek Talk, a journey into the things we love. I'm your host, Shane Stacks. Thanks so much for pressing play. And today we are boldly going with Mat Bradley-Tschirgi, author of Star Trek Video Games, an unofficial guide to the final frontier. So we're going to be talking about video games and Star Trek, two of my favorite geeky things. Before we do that, I want to give Matt a chance to tell us a little bit about himself. It's Matt with one T. Matt.
Yes, sir.
We'll make sure I say this right. Tschirgi, hyphenated, right?
Yep.
When people are looking for you. All right, tell us a little bit about yourself, Matt, before we rip into the fascinating world of Star Trek video games.
Right. So I was one of the first people to get a BFA in, I'm looking at the diploma right now, in interactive design and game development from SCAD, Savannah College Art of Design, way back in 2005. So, and I've done some work on games and software over the years, sometimes as a tester and technical writer, sometimes just as a consultant. But yeah, I've been playing video games my whole life. My first console was an Atari 2600. I didn't have a home computer until, my family didn't have a home computer until like the mid 90s. Would have been like a Packard Bell 486 with a double speed CD-ROM drive and a shitty sound card. So I think, but more to the point, I've written a handful of books. Most of them are nonfiction, usually about video games or movies. And but I also have one collection of short stories. I should be coming out with the second collection, hopefully later this year.
Now, is that horror? Are you short stories horror? Okay.
Yeah, they're more like horror comedy. I guess I'd compare them to sort of like.
So like the current political situation, horror.
I think comedy. So. Like the current political situation, or I'd kind of describe it as like Clive Barker meets Douglas Adams or something. It's like the least commercial idea possible. But yeah. So, but they're fun. I don't know quite where they come from, but it's I do like doing fiction to mix it up every once in a while. So, and Star Trek was something I started with the movies. I think the first one I watched was Star Trek IV: The Voyage Home on videotape as a kid. And
that's an interesting one to start with.
Yeah, because I mean, it's a fish out of water story, no pun intended.
Oh, big time, yeah.
Yeah, but but if you don't know what they're like normally, to see them in San Francisco,
right,
it doesn't do a whole lot for you. But I still, thought it was funny. And even though my dad would talk about the series incessantly, he would skip class in college and watch the repeats of Star Trek on TV. We never owned like seasons of the episode on videotape or anything. So it was really my wife that got me more into the TV shows stuff later on, but I got into it first from the movies. And I think as far as the games go, I had a collection called Interplay 10th Anniversary. And one of the games on there was the CD-ROM version, or no, it actually was just the diskette version of Star Trek 25th Anniversary. So it didn't even have the voices on it.
Oh, because it was diskette.
Right.
Right. Yeah, we'll get into those. Those are good games. I think Interplay did some good Star Trek stuff. So yeah, just to your Amazon bio blurb says that you are a writer who specializes in pop culture, nonfiction, and horror fiction. So
yep.
I hope your anthologies go well. And you just finished wrapped up a multi-year podcast called Sequel Cast 2, if I understand right.
That's right. Yeah, you can still listen to it at sequelcast2.com. We started out looking at movies in a franchise, one film at a time. It went from 2009 to the beginning of 2024. And I just stopped doing it because that's a long time to do a podcast, and I wanted to spend more time writing books and other things. I'm happy to be a guest on other shows, and I'm not, I'm not against doing a podcast again in the future, but I felt like I kind of said what I needed to say.
Work.
It is a lot of work. People don't realize it. It's a lot of work every time. And it's,
I tell people that by the time I talk to the guest, schedule the guest, record, edit, publish, and then promote that it's out, one podcast is probably about 8 or 9 hours of work at least. So with the editing and because I go through and edit and I clean them up and all of that. So I don't usually edit them so the substance has changed. I don't like that, but I do edit them so they're a little smoother, or like strange noises are pulled out and stuff like that. So yeah, you gotta love it. If you don't, I've been podcasting since 2015. It was a radio show and a podcast, and during COVID, I went podcast only. You gotta love it because it is a lot of work. So,
Absolutely, yeah. You don't
yeah,
like writing books. You don't do it for the money necessarily.
right.
If
Most
you
people
do
don't anyway.
no, right. I mean, if you
Yeah,
do the math with the hours, it's kind of nuts. But yeah, I used to do college radio. I used to do some stuff at the local community, one of the radio stations out here, a community one called KBOO FM, in Portland, and used to teach classes and stuff. And it was, I should probably do that again. That was a lot of fun. But recently, I guess more to the point with this book with Star Trek, I was at Star Trek to Las Vegas, and I was invited up to be on a panel about Star Trek video games. And on the panel, I mean, I talked about my book, but I was there with Dan Martin, who is the head writer and designer on Star Trek Resurgence, one of the newer games covered in the book, and also with the Tipton brothers, who have played a lot of Star Trek video games, but they do a lot of like crossover comics. They did like a Star Trek meets Planet of the Apes comic. They
yeah.
did they did a really cool comic that took the original Harlan Ellison screenplay of City on the Edge of Forever and adapted it.
I've got that.
But yeah, those but anyhow, it was flattering and cool to be on a stage with those people.
Nice. Yeah, very nice. And then that kind of led to this book.
Well, I mean, the book was already the book kind of it launched in the UK before that convention happened in early August. But I was there to promote the book and be on the panel, and I had never been to that convention in Vegas before. I've talked at several conventions here in Portland, Oregon. It was my first one out of state, but I'd love to do more of that. That was it was a lot of fun, and although the heat in Vegas was like 109 degrees,
Wow.
which is a lot. Even if you're inside, you can feel it.
Yeah. Wow. That is crazy. Yeah. And then you also, we have a mutual friend, Matt Barton, who does Matt Chat. He's literally a professor of video games.
Yes.
And English, if I remember right. He does Matt Chat. Great show. He does playthroughs and also interviews with game developers. I actually consider his show important because he's interviewed a lot of game developers. So in the future, when people are like, how did this game happen? Or what was that developer like? I mean, he's got a lot of really good stuff on his show, great conversations with video game developers. So, and I don't know, within the past year, something like that, you've started helping him produce that. Is that correct?
Yeah. I mean, I've worked with Matt Barton for 20 years. I used to write for a site he helped found called Armchair Arcade. I don't know if it's
okay. I didn't
online,
know that. I didn't know that you were part of Armchair Arcade. Okay.
Yeah, back when I was still in college and stuff, I was writing some stuff for them. So we go way back. And but yeah, the past year I've helped produce Matt Chat for him. So what that involves is pitching guests to get on the show and doing that part, booking them. Which I happen to be good at. That's not a skill I knew anything about before I started podcasting, and also help with the questions. So
you learn
so many skills
art of inviting guests on real quick if you're a podcaster. So the majority of my guests, I've gotten some fairly big name guests. A lot of them I just reached out politely on Twitter and said, hey, I like your stuff. Would you like to come on? And they're like, most people are like, yeah. I mean,
right. Yeah, no, Twitter's good. Email's good. I think the past year I've helped book some pretty good names like Jordan Mechner, Ken and Roberta Williams, Michael A. Stackpole we just had on recently.
Yeah, you just had Michael Stackpole on. That was interesting. So yeah. Well, great. I think that's great that you're helping Matt. I love his channel. And then you and I hang out. There's that loose Facebook chat group that it's been going on for years, but it crystallized around Matt Barton. But yeah, anyway, well, that's cool. So folks, check out Matt Chat on YouTube. I think it's a really great show. I mean, it's an entertaining show, but it's also important. I really think so. So for the hobby, for video games, role-playing games, all that stuff, there will literally be scholarship in pop culture archaeology in years to come because they've influenced so much of pop culture. So, and culture itself. So by default, by extension, I guess. So anyway, all right. So let's move on to Star Trek video games. So you have a book out called Star Trek Video Games, an unofficial guide to the final frontier. And you said it came out in the UK
in June.
August? In June.
There was like June in this year in the UK, and then elsewhere in August. It's available in hardcover and Kindle formats. There is a soft cover coming, although I'm not sure when I don't think that comes out until next year.
Okay.
And this is with White Owl Books, which is an imprint of Pen and Sword Books. They're out of the UK. I found out about them through just looking on Amazon, seeing what kind of video game books were selling. And I've, done stuff through really small presses, and I would consider this like a medium-sized press, and just kind of reaching out to them and pitching them some stuff. And it took some time, but we, kind of agreed on the Star Trek thing. Actually, funny enough, it started out as a pitch for Star Wars video games, but they didn't want that. But then, and I said, what about Star Trek? And they're like, yes. And I'm like, yay. And then I had to figure out how to run all these games on my computer, which we're already part of the retro scene. I knew how to do some of it, but man, those Windows 95, Windows 98 games, I got them all running on my Windows 11 machine somehow, but it was really difficult. I had to lean on some resources to get that done. And even, you've been a gamer for a long time, like myself. Even back in the day, getting those things to run with all the different graphics cards and drivers was a nightmare.
Yeah. Yeah. In some ways, the all the emulators and stuff we have now is sort of a embarrassment of riches, compared to used to. It's like, oh, you had to have this and that and the right sound card, and you had to do your IRQ settings, and
the
IRQ settings. My goodness. And then the memory, you had to trick Windows or DOS or whatever, because the maximum memory space was like 512. It was crazy. I don't know.
You'd have to do the dip switches on the cards,
the dip switches, literal physical switches.
Yes.
And I think 640K was the max memory, so you had to trick stuff. It was crazy, but yeah, what you're talking about reminds me, because I helped Matt Barton with the second edition of Dungeons and Desktops, and one of the pitch points for that books was all new in color screenshots.
Right.
So we had to get all these screenshots from these games. And yeah, a lot of times we had no choice but to just run the game and grab a screenshot from it. But anyway, we're not here to talk about that book. We're here to talk about Star Trek games.
So I can tie it into my book where, I do have 3 full color photographs for each game. And I had to, do it just with print screen. And that's harder to do than it sounds, especially these older 2D games. You can't control the camera to make it look cool. And you want to have lasers firing or have something interesting.
Right. You want to have something compelling in the photo.
And I made the choice. And I think it was the right one. One out of every 3 pictures for each game, I decided to do the title screen, because with these older games, and mostly it's older games, there's some more recent stuff in there near the end. But every time you saw that damn title screen as these things would load, and it is a nostalgia book in a lot of ways. And I figured, well, if someone looks and goes, oh, I remember that title screen, it would really hit them in the feels, I guess, as the kids would say.
Yeah.
So that's kind of from a screenshot perspective, is a title screen interesting? Not necessarily, but I think it's more of, it was part of that experience.
Nostalgia. Yeah. People remember that title screen splashing up. Yeah. So, and here's from the forward or the intro to your book.
Right.
Here's kind of your thoughts on what games you decided to cover. You said, I elected not to cover arcade-only games, including the best-selling pinball titles, because it's a bit outside of scope. Along those lines, platforms listed for the games are what I consider to be the core platforms. So basically, it's either a PC, and by PC, maybe we also mean Mac, or Amiga. It's a personal computer or game consoles, sounds like is what you covered.
Yeah, and I decided to really specify that. One, like, I was not going to cover every Star Trek game. That would have just driven me crazy.
You can't. I found a list a couple of days ago, and I was absolutely mind-boggled. I was on it wasn't Giant Bomb. It was gaming.trekcore.com.
I haven't even heard of that one. Okay.
They listed every game on there, and I mean, it is a monstrous list
It's over
because they're
100,
listing everything.
right? It's
Yeah,
over
it's a
100, and
lot.
it's well worth pointing out that, and this goes for both personal computer games and video games, which I call video game stuff on a console or a handheld. I'll use Star Trek 25th anniversary as an example. There is, let's say, and this is off the top of my head, but let's say there was half a dozen games with the title Star Trek 25th anniversary, and all of them were different. The Nintendo one, the Game Boy one, the one on the PC, even the CD-ROM version had some changes from the diskette version.
Well, I
So
was actually surprised to see that 25th anniversary made it on the Game Boy. I'm like, how do you
yeah.
play it? I mean,
Now that's
was
not
it
one I happened to
playable?
cover in the book, but it was.
Yeah,
I thought about it, and it was at some point you have to kind of draw a line in the sand. Initially,
right.
the table of contents, I had stuff in chronological order, and then I was reading it, and it felt very disjointed because it kept hopping between Next Generation and original series and Voyager and back and forth. And I said, well, wait a second. With Star Trek, people have their favorite series, so why not just organize it by what TV show universe the game takes place in, and then I also have stuff that's around the movies, which I consider kind of its own thing. And I think the last chapter is like the stuff on the most more recent TV shows on Paramount Plus, because now there's more Star Trek series out there than ever before, and I would argue too many.
Uh, I wouldn't argue too many. I would argue many of them are, they don't feel like Trek to me. And
I
I'll just leave it at that. So some
right,
of them do, some of
fair.
them don't, and I'll leave it at that. So, but yeah, there is a lot of, you can quickly would dilute the brand or
Yes.
make people weary of the brand, exhaust people on the brand. So I'll tell you a show that's out now that I haven't watched yet, but it gets a lot of really positive word of mouth, is that Star Trek Prodigy show that's aimed at kids, and it has like
Mhm.
Janeway in it. It's animated. I haven't seen it, but I hear good things about it. So I don't know.
Right. I only saw the first episode of season one, which I didn't care for, but I've heard season two is more Voyager focused and is a lot better. So I should give it
Yeah.
another chance. The second season just hit Netflix in the US. So yeah.
Yeah. I need to give Lower Decks another chance. I watched like 2 or 3 episodes and I'm like, okay, I can see why people like it, but this isn't the Trek. I don't want Star Trek um, in that vein, I guess, in that,
Mhm.
that kind of half serious, but
I would
which is
compare Lower Decks to the Orville in a way, in that the first season's a bit manic and then it kind of settles down a bit. I
settled.
mean,
Well,
yeah.
that's what I was going to say. Ironically, I like the Orville, and
Mhm.
I'm critiquing Lower Decks, but the Orville and Lower Decks had a similar approach in their tone and style, and Orville totally calmed down to where it was like 10% ridiculous and like 90% very good storytelling. So I don't know. I'll give Lower Decks another chance. Um, but I only watched the first season of Picard. I might go pick up the next couple of seasons at some point and watch them, or not pick them up. I mean, I've got them on streaming or whatever. I tapped out on Discovery, I think, after the third season. Like I really kind of hang with it, and I ended up tapping out. Not that it was terrible.
Right.
It's good sci-fi, but it just wasn't, in my opinion, the Trek that I wanted to watch. Um, so I almost ended up calling it emote Trek. It just seemed like they were just constantly emoting at each other and telling each other how much they all meant to each other. It just wasn't my Star Trek, right? And I
It's a
didn't
lot of
like,
people, it's a lot of people crying.
yeah,
And
yeah,
on the I like the podcast Inglorious Treksperts a lot, and in fact, the stage I was on at Star Trek to Las Vegas, Inglorious Treksperts, the people that run that show, had to come up with 4 days of content at a convention of panels, which is a lot.
it is a
Um,
lot. Yeah,
and so, but they made a good point about Discovery on several times on their show, where it's like there's such a casual nature to the way the crew interacts with each other. There's not the chain of command that the original series had, where the captain is the captain and that means something, as opposed to people practically going like, "Yo, what's up, dude? Let's high five." Where it's
right.
not,
Yeah, it was a different
it's a different
style.
vibe, right? Yeah.
It was like we're all. It was like we're family. It's like the Fast and Furious
Yes.
meme joke. I mean, it's their family. But there was some good stuff. I liked some of the characters. Um, I liked some of the storytelling just overall. And then I liked that they went into the future, and
Hmm.
spoilers, in like whatever season, because then it solved all the problems of the incongruities between the stuff in the first couple of seasons. Like, this doesn't match the time period you say that you're in, right? Like,
Sure,
there's
sure.
clashes with the canon and the levels of technology and all that. So they move them into the future, which was a smart move. But then they made the Federation all shattered and messed up. And I was like, because something had happened with warp drives that blew up the galaxy. I don't know. I just tapped out. I gave it about 3 seasons and then it wasn't. But if other people dig it, more power to them. So anyway, we're getting off on a tangent. I want to bring it back to your games. So yeah, you mentioned the games you chose to cover, and you said that in this book you curated Star Trek video games you found to be notable. All right, and then you said some are phenomenal, several are terrible, all of them are interesting. So it's kind of like may you live in interesting times. What does interesting
Yes.
mean? So yeah,
Right.
so let's frame this right off the bat. Even among PC and console games, I don't think everything's represented here, right? You're like, this is the stuff that's really worth mentioning. Like, how many games do you cover?
I cover 42 games, and I happen to like Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, so I was pleased with that number. But that's not one
Right.
I chose to settle on. There's a few chapters I cut from the book because of I had a word count I had to hit, so I had to make some tricky choices, and I focused on I think games that did a wide variety of genres, and unintentionally my write-ups on the game focus on the UI a lot. I tried to sort of tell a history of computer and video games through Star Trek games, if that makes sense. So
No, that makes sense because Star Trek games have been out since the beginning.
that's right.
I
And
mean,
they'll,
way back
yeah.
on when people had what, not supercomputers, what's the word? Mainframes
Mhm.
at college campuses and whatever, they were making Star Trek games. So yeah.
And most of these games were new to me, so I mean, it was a real, no pun intended, but like a discovery process going through. Yeah, going through these titles, and even going back to that very first one, which goes under different names like Star Trek or Super Star Trek, where it's just ASCII characters, it's text based, it's like a more complicated version of Battleship in a lot of ways. I was really impressed by like the scope of that because I was sort of expecting it to be maybe a roguelike or something a bit more arcadey, but like right off the bat, they have some real ambition, and I think Star Trek as a media franchise is a lot more difficult to adapt into a video game than Star Wars, where that's more action focused and you have people waving around lightsabers and spaceships. But Star Trek, to me, is about like ideas and ethics, and how do you make that into a game? Like that's a big it's a tall order, and I think some of these succeed more than others. And I think that's in particular why I like things like Star Trek Judgment Rights or even the new game Star Trek Resurgence, where they're more dialogue and puzzle based, more like Space Quest or Monkey Island kind of gameplay, where choose your own adventure sort of stuff, where it kind of, to my mind, reflects the spirit of the show better.
So does the saddest vaporware in the history of Star Trek games and really gaming in general, one of the saddest ones. Do you mention at all the Vulcan's Fury game that Interplay looked
I
into and then released a
Yeah,
trailer for and it
it's
never came
funny you
out?
mentioned that. I mentioned that in passing. I considered making it have its own chapter, but I was chatting with our mutual friend Rebecca Heineman, who is one of the
Right.
founders of Interplay,
Uh-huh.
and I told her what I know, what I could research about it, and she didn't really have much extra stuff on it. I think had I had more time, I could have had that been its own chapter, but I approached it in passing. And the sad thing is, from what I could tell, and for those that don't know, Star Trek Secret of Vulcan Fury is kind of like the white whale of the Star Trek games that never came out, as far as vaporware is concerned. But it had so much advertising in magazine, it had advertising in the back of cereal
It
boxes.
had an amazing trailer. Like they were releasing
Yes.
trailers on other
Yep.
Interplay video games. Yeah, and it was an
Right.
amazing trailer. Yeah.
Amazing trailer. And I mean, for the time, I mean, for context, this was around the time like Toy Story, A Bug's Life, some of the early Pixar stuff, Shrek, around the time all that stuff was coming out. So The graphics looked phenomenal. The advertisement was like, really high resolution rendered of Kirk, Spock, and McCoy that really looked a lot like him, especially for the time. And there was a demo at E3 that leaked on YouTube not that long ago. From what I understand, that DC Fontana, who unfortunately has passed, and she was a female writer on the original series, and then some, I think maybe season 1 or 2 of Next Generation. She wrote the entire script out for the game. I don't. There's rumors that all the voices were recorded. From what I could tell, that's not the case. Also, DeForest Kelley had passed by that time, so they were going to use a voice actor that was a sound alike. And in her lifetime, DC Fontana tried to see if she could adapt that script into a novel, and Paramount wouldn't let her. So
the rights were reserved for
because of the rights or something. But I'm in the process of trying to dig more into that to do so maybe you'll see an article from me and someone else, kind of trying to find that script, and if so, doing some stuff with it, because it would be great if they could make that into a game now with a modern engine and stuff.
Well, yeah, I mean, it looked great. It was like, I mean, I was salivating. I was like, wow. And, people go to YouTube, look up Secret of Vulcan Fury. I may link it in the show notes at shaneplays.com. There will be, or shaneplays.com. There will be show notes for this episode at shaneplays.com, by the way. So go check that out. But I'll tell you, I think it might have even been Rebecca Heineman.
Yep.
That kind of, I was surprised to learn how much of the game wasn't done, considering the heavy promotion in that trailer they put out. Like I said, they had some proof of concept animation done. And then they had some voices recorded, and I guess they had a script, and that was like it. But they were putting out trailers and advertising like it was ready to go. And, but anyway, so yeah, that's an interesting, and I think Interplay wanted to make it. They probably ran out of money, or
or maybe they ran out of time. Maybe they ran out of time with the license. I mean, that's one thing with these Star Trek games. It's not like Star Wars and LucasArts, where a lot of them are done in-house by, mostly the same production company. Star Trek had so many different licensees doing games. At one point, it was Simon & Schuster. For a lot of them, it was Interplay, like you mentioned. But there's, over a dozen of these different developers, and because of that, I think there's less quality control. So overall, the Star Trek game, right. So overall, the Star Trek games, I would say, are worse than the Star Wars games, but they're also, I think, more daring and more interesting, to use an overloaded term.
There are some good games in the mix.
Yes,
but because of the things you just mentioned, there's also a lot that you have to sift through to get to the good.
And while you can buy some of these games on Steam and GOG, the good old games, it's really only like a dozen of them or so, not counting the new ones, which is really frustrating. And that's part of what motivated me to write the book, is hopefully, even though the book is unofficial, maybe it can get people to petition, Paramount to loosen the purse strings
release more games,
and have more of these old ones. I mean, one of these games I covered that I think would still do really well today is Star Trek: The Game Show. It was like Star Trek's take on You Don't Know Jack, and they had John Delancey as Q as the smartass host, and it just was a really good.
That's perfect.
Fit of theme. Perfect. It was full motion video. I mean, pretty low resolution, but I think it was released after Star Trek Generations, or maybe around that time. So it covers up through some of Voyager. So it's a good variety of questions. And you can't play. You can play local multiplayer. You can't play multiplayer online. But that would sure be cool if they could patch that in.
Yeah. No, I saw that. That jumped out at me in the list of games that you covered. I never played that. I do remember You Don't Know Jack, and that was a fun. If people never played You Don't Know Jack, you're in a game show with a snarky host, and you can do stuff like Screw Your Neighbor, where the screw literally drills into your other. The person you're against and stuff like that. So kind of looking through it, like I say, you organize it by era, and by era we mean TV show. So you got the original series, you got the Next Generation, Deep Space Nine. You did Deep Space Nine and Star Trek Voyager together, which I guess makes sense because they were on TV at the same time, weren't they?
Yes. Well, DS9 came before Voyager, but it was pretty
Right.
close to each other. And I think Voyager tended to do a little better
Okay.
in the ratings. But like I considered putting Elite Force 2 in there, but it was just something where I wanted to
Well, Force
cover
2 is,
other things.
yeah, yeah. I mean, Elite Force was fun. I'm not
Hmm.
a big third person or first person shooter person, but when there's an IP on top of it that I enjoy, I'll often play first person shooters. And Elite Force is, I had a lot of fun playing that. Then you've got the feature films, you got the crossovers where there's more than one TV show, and then you got
Hmm.
Paramount Plus and beyond. So, one thing that jumped out at me that I want to ask you about, uh, because you've got Star Trek Online in here under feature films, uh, and I think Star Trek Online has been around since like 2009. It's been around for a
Yeah.
long time.
Yeah. I
Uh,
was in the open beta for that when I went to PAX 2009 and I signed up for the beta for that. And I think even subscribed to it for a little bit. And of course, I played through some of it again to research for this book. And that it's still going. I mean, it came out around the same
no,
time
I,
as Lord
I
of.
still play it.
Oh, do
I
you?
have an
Okay. Yeah.
active. I pop in every now and then and play it,
Right. I
and
mean, the
run a
way they've
mission or yeah,
optimized that game and changed the starting areas, to say nothing of the mechanics over the years, is impressive because it came out a little bit after Lord of the Rings Online, I want to say, and
right,
that one's still going too. So it's
right.
uh, notable that they keep it going. I'm a bit confused as to why it's on consoles because I don't think those MMOs play very well on consoles compared to all the keyboard things. But
I guess there's enough of a base because yeah, there's several MMOs that are also on consoles. But yeah, Star Trek Online. I was just curious because there's so many different influences and eras. How did you make the decision to put it under the feature films? Did that just make the most sense, or like what
it
was
did because I thought about when the game launched, and you had Leonard Nimoy, who was still with us at the time,
he
do a
was
big.
narrating it?
He did. He
Yeah,
had a
he was
narrating, and
narrating.
it tied into the
Yeah,
end of Star Trek Nemesis, where it talked about Romulus and Remus and all those things as kind of the catalyst for at least the setting for when that game launched. I mean, it's changed since then. If you start as a human, you go to Starfleet Academy, and it ties into Star Trek Discovery, and the character of Tilly is giving you kind of mission briefings as you're on the campus. And then now, we're going to get Starfleet Academy with some of those characters as a TV show coming up next year.
right.
So,
Yeah. So I don't know. I think Star Trek Online. I don't know if I would play it as an MMO in general if I wasn't into Star Trek. But if you like
mhm.
Star Trek, it's fun to play. And I've played it off and on for years. I've got I don't even know. It's like uh, level 51 or something. So
Oh,
I'm
wow.
like
Sure.
tier six ships. But I've been playing the same character off and on probably since soon after it came out. So um, now I noticed that you didn't include, and I'm not trying to
Sure.
do a 2020 investigative journalism. But I noticed that you didn't include any of the games from JJ Trek or the Kelvin timeline.
Yeah. That's one of the chapters that got cut. I wrote one on the game just titled Star Trek, which is set in the Kelvin verse, the
Right,
J.J.
it's set in
Abrams
the
movie.
Kelvin verse.
And it
Right,
takes
first
place,
person shooter. Yeah.
well, third person, but you can
Oh,
swap.
right. Yeah, you're
And
overhead. Yeah.
it's co-op with Kirk and Spock, and if you don't play with someone, the computer does a poor job of controlling the other character.
Right.
And I even did, I mean, I interview her for other stuff in the book, but I got some good material from Kat Bailey, who's been a gaming journalist for a long time. She works for IGN right now, but she's done stuff for Kotaku and OneUp.com back in the day. And I just didn't include it in the book for space reasons, and also I just really truly hate that game. I think it's really disappointing. Other than walking on the bridge, it's really clumsy, and it only has like 3 missions at the end of the day, and you have these fiddly controls and physics puzzles, and not really good combat, and it was a game I considered buying for full price at the time, but instead I rented it from Redbox. And my wife and I mentioned she's a big Star Trek fan, probably a bigger one than me, to be honest. We rented it from Redbox back when that was the thing, when you could rent games from it. And after like 30 minutes, she looked at me and says, "Do we have to keep playing this?" And I said, "No."
Wow. Yeah, it was the interesting things to me from that game is there were some teleporter or transporter mechanics where you had to
Yeah,
transport over here and then transport over there while in the middle of combat and stuff. That was kind of interesting. And then there was these little asides from like Scotty, voiced by who's that? Simon Pegg,
right.
um, explaining the physics of Star Trek, and then like McCoy's log talking about giving birth to Gorn triplets and how they almost bit his fingers off. So that was interesting, but the game itself, yeah, was forgettable. It wasn't
And I have
a
to say,
great.
like and there's some interview out there where J.J. Abrams is really angry about how the game turned out because
Oh, really?
he was initially shown stuff like the bridge, but I think the parts in between missions where you go around on the bridge is mapped out, just like the movie, and it even does the lens flare stuff in the
Right,
Kelvinverse
right.
movies, which is impressive. But J.J. Abrams has been a gamer for a long time, and he wanted more
So he
involvement in the
was
game, didn't really get it, and when it came out, it I don't know if it was rush development or whatever, but when I talked to Kat Bailey, she had mentioned she went to a press event where they're showing off the game, and it was a very limited. They call it a vertical slice, right? They show you
right.
a
Yeah,
small part of the
right,
game, and it looked really cool, and they talked a good game, but it's at the end of the day, the proof is in the pudding, and so
right. The actual game.
it's too bad it turned out the way it did because the Kelvinverse is a fun setting, and you mentioned McCoy, Carl Urban's um, homage, let's say, to DeForest Kelly as Bones McCoy is like spookily good. Like you would have no idea that actor is Australian.
Oh,
Like he
right.
sounds so much like the real guy. It's fantastic.
No, no. I mean, there's stuff I like about JJ Trek. I consider them good action movies.
Yes.
But they're not the best Star Trek storytelling, but they're very good action movies, and they do some fun stuff with the characters. So I can watch them and I can enjoy them. But it's not the Star Trek. Like if I have my druthers, like, hey, do
Mm-hmm.
you want like Star Trek set in their Prime universe or JJ Trek? I'm probably going to go with the Prime universe. So, although these days, with all the TV shows out there, I can make some similar criticisms. Um, but what you can't say is that people don't have a lot of Star Trek now. So they are definitely getting a lot of Star Trek. So out of all these games, do you have a favorite and a least favorite out
Sure.
of all these? Because you
That's a
have
great
42
question.
games. You have 42 games in here.
That's right. My answer to this kind of changes depending on the day and the mood I'm in. But
Right.
because it's just such it's a question where your opinion can kind of change. But the one that really sticks out to me as being just a real impressive package overall, and it's a game that's sadly unavailable legitimately unless you buy it on eBay and try and get it to work, is Star Trek Klingon Academy.
Mm,
It's a flight sim. It has full motion. It improves on kind of the crappy controls from the first Starfleet Academy game that was on PC, but there was versions of that before, I think on 32X and Super Nintendo. But the Klingon Academy, it's more fun because you're playing as the bad guys with the Klingons. It's set between Star Trek 5 and 6, and they got two actors that are no longer with us, sadly, but they got both David Warner and Christopher Plummer to reprise their Klingon roles from Star Trek 6.
nice.
And you have these actors with Shakespearean backgrounds doing far better acting than any other full motion video game at the time. It circles
Right. It's
around
far,
Wing
far. Yeah.
Commander, and right,
Yeah. Much
like
better than it deserved.
and so I mean, but I'd recommend people go to YouTube and just look at the cutscenes. And there's some people that have even done 4K AI upscaling that looks phenomenal. But the gameplay itself is fun with the missions, and it's in brief, the story part of it is you're doing a simulation where it's what if the Klingons got the Genesis device and used it on Earth, which is
Mm,
cool. And then the second half takes place in the real world, so to speak, and you're trying to um, prevent a kind of civil war of sorts between I don't remember their character names, but Christopher Plummer's Klingon and David Warner's Klingon, where it kind of sets up some stuff that we'll see later in Star Trek 6, The Undiscovered Country. And there's a very cheesy line where Christopher Plummer, it's one of the last lines of the game, where he looks at the camera and is like, now we must voyage to the undiscovered country. And he
oh,
might as well wink, but you
yeah.
kind of expect
Wink.
some of that.
Yeah.
right?
Yeah,
But it's I
you're just
think
having
because
some
I think
fun.
the quality of the acting and the getting to play as Klingons, I think makes that one of my favorites out of what I've covered. As for least favorite, I would say this one is a bit of a guilty pleasure. It's an unreleased game that I covered that leaked online a while ago. It was developed by Bandai Namco, or it might have just been Bandai or
Now, is
Namco
this
at the
covered
time.
in your book?
It is, yeah. It's Star Trek
Okay.
V: The Final Frontier for the Nintendo Entertainment System.
When I saw that, I was like, I don't
Yes,
remember that they made a Final Frontier
yeah.
game. But
That never
anyway, yeah,
officially
go ahead.
came out. It's unfinished. It's only 3 levels, but the last level you play as Kirk and you get to punch the god alien to death, and it's a floating head in the screen. And I
That's
mean
awesome.
it's not, it's a side-scrolling game. Like, it's not great, but it's just Star Trek V: The Final Frontier doesn't
It's a
have a lot
terrible
of
movie.
action, right? Yeah.
It's a terrible
So
movie.
to make that into a game is just really bizarre.
So, did they
Um,
have a scene where Uhura was doing a dance
I
behind
wish.
feathers
No,
in the
no.
desert
There's only 3
on top
levels,
of a
right?
cliff?
Yeah, no.
Yeah.
There's only 3 levels. The
Holy
first level,
smokes.
you're I think it's Kirk, and you're on the planet of what is it? The City of Paradise, the kind of peace planet, right?
Yeah,
And
they had the supposedly, you know, you had a Romulan, a Klingon,
the
and I guess a
delegates.
human
Yes, right.
delegates where supposedly it was a token. They say, "Oh no, we have this peaceful planet where all 3 species, you know, are in diplomatic unity or something." But
And
it
so
was
the
a
first level, you're on that planet fighting against Cybox minions
right.
in the boring desert background. The second level, I think you're supposed to be Scotty, and you're running around the
You
Enterprise
think you're supposed to
for
be
some
Scotty?
reason.
Like, I
It's not
think
very
we're
clear.
Scotty.
It's not very clear from the
A
graphics, but if you
tricorder, I think.
right, if you look at the pictures from it, there's some little dialogue scenes
Yeah, I
between
need to go
levels
look at this.
that have a very sassy looking Sulu that I heartily approve of.
All
Um,
right, I'm gonna go look at this. It's on
yeah,
page 108, the final
it's on
frontier.
page 108.
Yeah, I'm going right now. This is great. Here we go. Got the splash screen. Yeah, I'm looking.
Right. So if you have to emulate that game to play it. I don't even recommend
Yeah,
playing it necessarily. You can probably get away with watching a let's play, but it's just so baffling and weird that
yeah.
it's
That
worth
Sulu looks kind of weird.
checking out. Yeah, it's
Yeah,
but they didn't have a lot to work with. He's in a little tiny box when he talks.
yeah.
Um,
Oh man. Well, okay. So, wow. And see, that's why I like having these conversations to learn about these hidden gems nobody ever knew
yeah.
about.
But I mean, I
And I
guess to
use
give you an
gem
answer
loosely.
of what's a legitimate game that actually came out that I think is one of the lesser games, I would say it's one you can get off of Steam and GOG. It's called Star Trek Hidden Evil, and it's a video game sequel to one of the worst Star Trek movies, in my opinion, Star Trek Insurrection. It was the
Okay.
next to
So
last
it's
Next Generation movie, and you don't get to play as Picard or Data. You get to play as a random Vulcan that's kind of doing jobs for them and shooting the aliens that get plastic
so it's
surgery
is it a
on
first
them.
person shooter or is it, I
No, it's a
remember
third
Hidden Evil
person.
coming out.
It's a third person game. There's some puzzles. It's mostly action. It was meant to be open world, but then to make it more accessible, it's broken up into levels, and it is just
Yeah, I'm looking at
um,
it right now.
it's
It
uninspiring.
almost looks like an adventure game.
It's less of an
Action
adventure
adventure.
game
Okay.
than you would think. Yeah, I'd say action adventures.
Yeah.
It's a bit like the Phantom Menace action adventure game, come to think of it, but it's just not good in that that's a movie game that shouldn't have a game. I mean, you talk about unreleased games. There was a Star Trek First Contact game that was in development that never came out for the PC, and it's like, them fighting the Borg. That makes a lot more sense for a video
That makes a
game.
lot more sense
Right.
than yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure why that
Well,
one never came out, but a big part of my research was if you look up on Google Computer Gaming World Archive, nearly every issue of that is archived as a PDF. And so I read a lot of those issues to find information out of what people were writing about at the time. And they mentioned some of these unreleased games in there in passing and kind of these, in the little preview sections. So
mm,
if you have time to kill and want to read about old hardware and software, that's a fun way to spend your time.
that's the way to do it. Yeah. Speaking of the Phantom Menace, that's a guilty pleasure for me because
Mm-hmm.
it's because of nostalgia. Honestly,
Yeah,
everybody that I knew, or a lot of people I knew, were playing that game when Phantom Menace came out. I was playing it. I remember talking to other people about it, and I go back and play it every now and then. But yeah, I wouldn't. The camera can be real awkward on that game, and some of the levels.
Yeah,
are
it's
strange.
overhead, but not quite, and it's a limited
Right.
field of view. And
it almost makes you feel like your neck is hurting in some parts when you're playing it because you can't quite get the camera to work the way you want. But so going back to the games you mentioned, so I didn't play Klingon Academy, but I did play Starfleet Academy.
Right.
And I enjoyed that game in the day. And it's basically you're a cadet. You know, it's got some full motion video stuff in between missions.
They got William Shatner, George Takei, and Walter Koenig are in it, which is fun, especially if you mess up on levels. They yell at you, which I always like.
You're right. And then you end up doing you literally, Kirk tells you about the Kobayashi Maru. So you go and find where he hacked the Kobayashi Maru and get to do the same thing. But it was fun. The thing that sticks to, you're supposedly on a starship, but it fights like you're in a fighter. Everything's very fast and you're blasty and but it was still a lot of fun.
Yes. And I would say it's still less arcadey than Wing Commander, because you can, if you go near planetary systems or black holes, you get sucked in. There's some more physics in there, and the missions are a bit more puzzly. And Starfleet Academy, along with Star Trek Klingon, are two Star Trek video games that had novelizations.
Oh, I didn't know that. Yeah,
which is unusual.
They were trying to go for that. Well, there was this huge push in the 90s and really in the 90s, but even later for multimedia, like, you know, we got to have a novel and a game. And, you know, Shadows of the Empire from Star Wars was a huge example of that.
Yes.
Where they were trying to do comic books.
And I'm pretty sure there's at least one or two novels that tie into Star Trek Online, come to think of it. But
oh, I didn't know that. So the other thing I want to talk about real quick, Star Trek V, The Final Frontier. That is, in my opinion, the worst Star Trek movie. Even I'm not a big fan of Nemesis. Insurrection, I don't hate. I kind of view it as a long episode of Star Trek: The Next Generation.
Sure.
And I like that, but I can see why people don't like it. But Star Trek V there was a lot wrong with that movie. But one thing that is it's one of the greatest scenes in all of Trek is when Sybok is offering to take people's pain away.
Yes.
And Kirk is 100%. Like, no, I want my pain. My pain makes me part of who I am. And he makes this big speech about, you know, I am who I am because of what I've gone through and this and that and the other. And, you know, it's bad for you to take away people's pain and the bad things, because then you're kind of erasing part of who they are. And that was a great scene. One of the best scenes in Star Trek, or Kirk moments, in my opinion. So
that one's good. I mean, also the sequence, I think right before that, Sybok is, he manages to take the pain away from Spock. The scene with Spock is okay. It's the whole thing. Yeah. Oh, he's half human.
McCoy
the McCoy is extraordinary. Yeah. Where he feels guilt over euthanizing his father. It's a really moving scene. It's the best scene DeForest Kelley ever did. Yeah. And unfortunately, when William Shatner was directing Star Trek V, and it was the one Star Trek movie he directed, it was during a writer's strike, so he couldn't do a lot to the script. And his original premise was sort of taken away from him, where the climax was, going off my memory, but he used to have the behind the scenes book written by his daughter, Elizabeth Shatner. But the original ending would have been not an alien pretending to be God and then revealing it's an alien, but the alien would say, I'm God. And they would mostly believe him. And then he would reveal himself to be the devil, and there would be demons and rock monsters attacking him. I don't think that would have saved the movie, but it also had things like Sybok. But it, you know, thematically, I think it would have been deeper. It also had Sybok at one point riding on a unicorn, and he'd use the horn of the unicorn to impale people. Like, it was a bit. I mean, there's crazy idea, and the whole concept for Star Trek V was inspired by Tammy Faye Baker in TV and
Evangelist.
The Evangelist, yeah, thank you. And that doesn't come across really in the movie.
No, it doesn't. So if it's a critique of people passing themselves off as religious
figures,
but then really they're just trying to take advantage of you.
Mm-hmm.
That really didn't come across because you only have a couple of minutes with that God thing at the end, and it's like, why does God use a spaceship? And then it goes south real quick and then they shoot it. So, I mean, that's
right. And actually what's better than the movie, I think, is like I think it's Marvel Comics did the comic book adaptation, and it reads better as a comic than watching it as a movie for whatever reason.
Interesting.
It's like a 50-page comic. It's really kind of, they slim down the story. I think they take out some of the jokes. Peter David, I think, did the adaptation, and it's that one's worth tracking down.
He took jokes out. Peter David took jokes out.
I think he took some jokes out. I mean, it's not a literal.
Right.
It's not as big as some of the other movie comic book adaptations, but it's. And I think, it had jokes in there because Star Trek 4 did well, and it had a lot of jokes. And when you're dealing with religion and throwing jokes in there, it kind of, the tone is very inconsistent. As we've spoken to death here, it's a movie with a lot of problems. And the one game of it that did come out that I do cover in the book is the PC game, where it uses cutscenes of still illustrations to tell the story of the first half of the film before you begin playing. Most of it is a flight sim. It only supported PC speakers, which is too bad, which takes something away from it. It does do VGA graphics. And then when you fight, there's a scene where Kirk fights the Klingon, and it turns into like a bad version of Street Fighter at that point. But like, it's not every movie needs to be a game.
Right.
And no, I think in both of those games I cover of Star Trek V are proof of that.
So I noticed that you didn't, and I don't mean this as a critique.
Sure.
I'm just curious. A few years ago, they came out with a virtual reality, you're on the bridge, and then they came out with, you didn't have to have virtual reality to play it. Were you just not impressed with that one? Or I haven't played it.
I wrote a chapter on that. That's another one I cut for time. I mean, I think, if there's demand and if people want it, just write in on Twitter and social media to White Owl Books saying you want a volume 2, because there's certainly enough games to, if I did a second one, to do that.
Yeah.
But yeah, that Bridge Crew game or whatever the title is, that one's a lot of fun. I don't have VR, but I played the version on PlayStation 4, I think, without VR. And it was really cool, right? With the headset, and you're kind of screaming at each other. And when things go sideways.
Multiplayer, people can take different.
It's co-op. You take different
positions,
parts on the bridge, and you really have to communicate and pay attention. They did a DLC for it that was Next Generation themed. The original version, the base game, is the original series, and it's a lot of fun. And it's too bad they didn't do more with that, because I think it's a good premise, and we could use more multiplayer Star Trek games where you play as different crews members.
Well, it seems like it would lend itself to it, right?
Right. Yeah.
And even like debating moral, like, that, like when you watch, there's an episode of Next Generation, I think it's the Hugh episode where, Hugh the Borg, and, they're wanting to use Hugh to give him a virus and send him back to the collective, and Crusher is like really arguing against them, and it was, so I could see with the right writing and the right, I don't know how to do it, like having those ethical, because the heart of Star Trek in a lot of ways is those ethical, how do we tackle these challenges ethically, in a VR or multiplayer.
Yeah. I mean, I would say as we,
stuff there.
Right. As we round stuff up here, I mean, that's another game I wish they'd re-release, is Star Trek Borg. That's a full motion video game where you're doing puzzles and making choices. And the premise is it's set during Next Generation. And I think it's like your father or something died on the big battle where Picard is the cutest. And John Delancey as Q comes into the scene and gives you an offer. Well, what if you could save your father? And you kind of go into this quantum leap scenario, and you have John Delancey as Q posing as a crew member in this like virtual scenario you're in, just being a smart ass. And just, again, I think the humor and John Delancey as Q is a really great character. Really helps make that game, I think, better than the other complete full motion video game, which was Star Trek Klingon, which Jonathan Frakes directed that one, but sometimes is a little bit too serious and doesn't quite. It's not as fun, I think, as the Borg one. But both of those, I think, should be. They're easy to play. They're short. The Star Trek Klingon game came with a limited version of. I think the software is still around, like the Dragon speech to text, where you can learn Klingon, and it has clips from the audio. There was an audiobook at the time where it's like learn Klingon in your car, where I think the actor that played was it Dartok or one of those does the voice does the Klingon language lessons, and you could even buy Hamlet in its original Klingon as a book.
Yeah, I know that they were converting some. Yeah, because they were doing jokes like Shakespeare's better in the original Klingon and stuff like that. I wanted to real quick. I was going to go through the books that you cover or the games that you covered and mention a couple of my favorites. Of course, 25th anniversary. Their 25th anniversary and Judgment Rights are excellent click adventure type games that also really capture Star Trek, the original series flavor, in my opinion. And
absolutely,
by click
the book,
adventure,
yeah. 25th anniversary and Judgment Rights were the last things to involve all of the original Star Trek crew on there.
Yeah,
which makes them notable. I would say the graphics, even for the time, were a bit simple. They look a bit like Lego guys walking around.
I think they did that on purpose, though. I don't know. I feel like they were trying to match the point and click aesthetic of the time.
Right. I will say a good effect of that with the characters being so little is it makes the spaces you're in, the rooms and things, feel really big, which is cool. And one of the book has some interviews in there, and I interview Michael A. Stackpole, who was just on Matt Chat, as you mentioned earlier, in there because he started his career. He's primarily a novelist now, but he started as a game designer for Interplay, and he wrote some of the scenarios for both the 25th anniversary and Judgment Rights.
Well, they're good games.
Yes.
If you're into Star Trek at all, I mean, it's like really, they're done well. They tell a good Star Trek story, and they're fun to play. I mentioned Starfleet Academy. I enjoyed that one a lot back in the day. I may not stand up to a replay all these years later, but I enjoyed it back in the day. Let's see here. Starfleet Command. I like it and I don't like it. Okay, so Starfleet Command they adapted the board game of Starfleet Battles into a video game. And I think it's a good game. It's a good tactical starship versus starship strategy, and you're controlling all the systems and managing your energy and this and that and the other. If you like Starfleet Battles, you might want to try it out. I just think that the Starfleet Battles game plays better turn-based, right? Because you're managing all this stuff and you don't have time to think about it and react. But they made multiple sequels to it, so somebody liked it a lot. So
yeah, I interviewed William Fisher for that one, who was the president of Quicksilver Software, who developed at least the first game. I'm not quite sure if they did the sequels. And I did ask, like, did you consider doing it turn-based? And he said they did at first, but then people were having so much fun playing the real-time version of it. I agree with you, though. I find that game a bit too hectic. I've never played the original tabletop version, but I've heard it's legendary and it has a lot of supplements for it.
Right.
So,
you're just managing so much stuff. You're managing all your systems, energies, this, that, and the other. It's very tactical, and it works well when you have time to think about it before the next turn starts. But Starfleet Command, if you're going to adapt it to real time, they did a really good job of adapting it. And I think it was cool that they even did it in the first place. And I did play it a lot. I just, comparing the two, I'm like, I think this just works better as a turn-based board game. Armada, real-time strategy, I thought was a very fun game. I didn't play Armada 2, but I really enjoyed Armada. Voyager Elite Force I thought was fun. I enjoyed it. It's basically a first-person shooter. They come up with this elite force, which is kind of like an away team, but more like a tactical combat away team, and you're fighting Borg and all this other stuff. Let's see here. Star Trek Online I've always mentioned. I enjoy that. I'll give a shout out. There's a couple of Stellaris is a 4x space conquest game. There's a couple of mods for Stellaris that are Star Trek based that are very good. And then they came out with Star Trek Infinite. I think that's the name of it,
Yeah, that one came out right after I had turned it into the publisher. And so it's always, you have to cut it off at some point. But yeah, if I ever
Yeah,
do a follow up to this, and I hope to at some point, I'll definitely include that in there. To me, I hadn't played a 4X game in a while, and I found Star Trek
yeah,
Infinite super super complicated. I
yeah. They didn't.
right,
Yeah,
the real stuff isn't great in that, but I've heard the mods in some way are better than Infinite for
I
Stellaris.
enjoy the mods are smoother. For some reason, what they did is they had for Infinite, they took the engine of Stellaris
Yeah,
and adapted it to a game, and something got lost in translation. Man, it's just not as enjoyable, and that's a general consensus out there. But if you want to play a 4 by space conquest game in the Star Trek world, just get Stellaris and get the mods. And Steam these days, if you buy it off Steam, makes it super easy to install mods. It's just kind of ridiculous. So, and then I want to give a shout out. You mentioned Star Trek Resurgence, which is kind of a choose your own adventure narrative. These, is it Telltale? It's not Telltale.
no,
It is Telltale.
no, it was by people that used to work for Telltale that they formed their own. I
Okay.
think it's Bruner Games or something like that. But I got to
But you were
interview
saying
the
you were
head
saying the
writer for
narrative
that,
was really good.
Dan Martin. The narrative is really good. It's set in during Next Generation. It's loosely based off one of the worst Next Generation episodes, but despite that, it does. You switch between the point of view of two characters. One is the second in command. The other is a lower decks kind of engineer character, right, who's fixing things. And so that it does a kind of upstairs downstairs thing. It mixes up the story a lot. There are some light stealth action and like space flight sequences, but if you die too many times, you can skip those. And I always like when that's an option
Right.
because you're really trying to
Well,
get the
yeah, because
story
if you're in a
to go
narrative
right.
game,
Yeah,
yeah, you might
and
not want to play twitchy stuff, right?
and this isn't a spoiler because it's in the trailers, but they have Spock is a character in the game, and they have a very good sound alike for Spock. This is the
Okay,
original Leonard Nimoy version, and Jonathan Frakes reprises his role as Riker late in the game, and that's fun too.
nice.
So
So this is
it's
in Resurgence. Okay,
so it's in
I haven't
Resurgence.
played it, but you mentioned it earlier, so I wanted to
Yeah,
give
it
it
just
more
it
shout out.
launched on Epic Game Store. It's on the consoles and on Steam now, so there's a lot of different ways to get it. It's I think the price is like $30 or something. It's a super reasonable price for the kind of game it is, and it's
Okay,
I think you get a kick out of that one. I'll give a shout out to two more things, and then I'll end with the story. I think from Star Trek to Las Vegas, which is amusing.
right, sure, go for it.
There is a real fun game called Star Trek Legacy that it came out on the PC and Xbox 360, and that one it takes place. It has like an alien that goes across, travels through time, and it has all the original Star Trek captains from Enterprise, Voyager, DS9, the original series, and TNG reprising their roles, and it's like a ship. It's not quite a full blown RTS like the Armada is, but it's kind of somewhere in between that and like a more of a ship simulator. But that one, I think the scope of the story and getting the real actors to voice the captain stuff makes it real cool. You command a small fleet of ships in that one. I'll also give a shout out to, and this is a game I like for its ambition, Star Trek Generations. This was released on the PC 3 years after the movie came out, unfortunately, but
Three
all
years.
3 years, but all the cast and crew, including William Shatner, Malcolm McDowell, Patrick Stewart, everyone reprises their roles. It plays a bit like System Shock. It's a first-person shooter, and different levels you play as different crew members. It does a lot of creative liberties to make the story of Star Trek Generations have more action in it,
Okay,
and I like it's what it's trying to do. It's not altogether successful. And my Star Trek to Las Vegas story, I'm doing this panel, and the moderator Mark A. Altman, who wrote and produced a really great movie from the '90s called Free Enterprise, that's worth tracking down.
oh
It's
yeah,
kind of
yeah,
it's a comedy
yeah,
about
right.
Trekkies. Anyhow,
Well, it also has William Shatner
that's right.
rapping
Yes.
Shakespeare. Yeah,
Yeah, no Tears for Caesar. Yeah, he does a rap
yeah.
at the end. It's fantastic. So with this thing, when one of the questions Mark had was, what do you think is the weirdest Star Trek game, right? He didn't say worst, he said weirdest.
Weirdest.
And I didn't get much sleep the night before. My mind was it's Vegas, so I was a little bit kind of getting used to Vegas again. And I flipped through my book and just pointed to a random game and started talking about it. The game I had to talk about was Star Trek Klingon Honor Guard, which is a first-person shooter that has a lot of melee combat, and you play as a Klingon. And it was not one of my favorites. And so I kind of, gave my honest thoughts about it. I mean, I've been involved with game design, with stuff with IP, and it's a miracle any game gets made or released. Really, people put so much work into these things. So I think I gave it a respectful dressing down. Afterwards, I'm at the booth, and this guy approaches me and says, "Well, I was the head writer and designer on that Star Trek Klingon Honor Guard you talked about." And
Not great.
and for a second, I'm like, "Ah, shit." But we had a great 15-minute conversation, and he was really honest and forthcoming about. He said he loved the panel. He thought it made good points. He explained why the game turned out the way it did. So that was a lot of fun. But the odds that
Right.
a game designer would be there about a game I was talking about, one of 100-something Star Trek games, is
Right.
just too funny.
That is. Did you get a chance to tell him, like, dude, I was totally addled and I was caught off guard and I just picked one at random and started talking? Did you even get a chance?
I did. Yeah. I was honest with him, and he thought that was funny.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
people, I find Star Trek fans to be pretty respectful in general. My wife and I have done the Star Trek cruise a few times. We're going again next year, where they have actors and people. It's like a comic book convention on a boat, and that's a lot of fun if you like Star Trek. It's more than a normal cruise, but anyhow, yeah. But it was a lot of fun writing the book. I learned a lot, and I have other video game books that I'm working on that I can't speak about. But if you go to matwbt.com, it directs you to my Amazon page where you can see all the different books I've done.
So there's matwbt?
Yes.
Let me make a note of that. I'll put it in the show notes.
A book I recently, I didn't write it, but I was an editor on, is I got to help Uwe Boll with his English language memoir called Uwe Boll Raw, a memoir, because I wrote the first English language book on his movies called Uwe Boll, the films of Uwe Boll Volume 1, the video game movies, was my first book back in 2019. So that got his attention, and we tried working on stuff in the memoir. He asked me to help him with it, which was flattering. So I got the manuscript from him, and we, went back and forth getting it into shape. And that came out through Bear Manor Media, who does a lot of good books on film. So that was fun to work on, and has nothing to do with Star Trek, but it was.
It's a cool project.
But it was a cool project, and you learn a lot about his life in Germany. It's more than just the movies, which is something I appreciated about it.
Well, I mean, if I'm sure he would desperately care about my opinion. I think his movies are fun. I mean,
right? No,
they're just fun movies. They don't have to be, the pinnacle of cinema. They're just fun movies, So,
and his non-video game stuff is often quite heavy and depressing, which I think makes him an interesting subject. He did a movie on Auschwitz. He did a movie on Darfur. He's done some prison movies. And I think it's the dichotomy of that stuff is what
that is
makes them interesting.
Yeah. All right, so on Shane Plays, I like to end with a bad joke of the week. Even though it's not a weekly show anymore, bad joke of the week just has a good ring to it, so I've stuck with it. So I picked out some in honor of Star Trek video games. Oh, and folks, that is Star Trek Video Games, an unofficial guide to the final frontier. There'll be a link at shaneplays.com, or just go to Amazon or just the web in general and type it in and you'll find it. So, all right, so here we go. Are you ready, Matt?
Yes.
Okay. How come when Picard says fire at will, no one blasts Riker?
That's good. I'm going to counter that with a bad Star Trek joke of my own I found on Reddit not too long ago. How many ears does Spock have?
I actually know this one. I'll let you give the answer. Yeah.
And it's 3: a left ear, a right ear, and a final front ear.
A final frontier. Yeah, that one almost made my bad jokes today. So I actually have more, because not only is it not weekly, there's more than one for the bad joke. Why did the Borg cross the road?
Why?
To assimilate the chicken. All right. And then finally, what's a pirate's favorite Star Trek character?
Changeling. I don't know.
No. Tasha Yar.
Oh, I recommendations if they come in. Very good.
All right, man. Matt, I've appreciated having you very much. Hope your book does well and your future books do well and all that good stuff. And I'm looking forward to digging deeper into your book. So I've already learned some stuff just talking with you, so I know I'll learn some stuff from your book. So
Well, thanks so much. It's been fun. I'd be happy to come on again sometime.
yes, live long, game long, and prosper. Game long and prosper, Matt. We will catch you next time on Shane Plays Geek Talk. Thanks so much for listening to Shane Plays Geek Talk. I certainly hope you enjoyed this journey into the things we love. For your convenience, show notes with helpful links for each episode can always be found at shaneplays.com. You can catch the podcast in several places, including on the blog at shaneplays.com, iTunes, Google Play Music, Stitcher, Podbean, Amazon Music, Verbal, YouTube, and more. If you like what you hear and would like to support Shane Plays Geek Talk, you can do so for as little as $1 per episode on Patreon at patreon.com/ShanePlays. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you next time. Stay geeky, my friends.